Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 151. It's time to pull out the crystal ball and look to see what the web's fortune will be in 2018. We are your hosts today, Justin Barrow, Danny Blue, and Leon Revel. Hello, lads. How's it going?
Hey, Justin.
Hey.
Amal will not be joining us today. She is currently in a meeting, but she sends her regards.
Job.
Yeah, jobs.
Something like that.
Jobs
Silly.
are tough. You know, sometimes we do actually write code instead of just talking about the writing of code. But before we go into just exactly what kind of code we've been writing as 2018 is kicked off and what we think the future of the web will be in 2018, let's throw it over to Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thank you, Justin. So first of all, TypeScript 2.7 release candidate has been made available. This includes many new features, fixes, and some breaking changes. So please check out the link on our site for all of the details. Angular 6 beta has been released, and this includes bug fixes, new features, and performance improvements. So again, check out the link for more details. Amsterdam JS, a conference on the 1st of June this year as an open call for proposals, so check that out. Chris Coyer has just recently published a new site which collates a ton of information about the power of serverless for front-end developers. So over there you can learn what serverless is, what the major providers are, and find loads of other resources. PouchDB 6.4.2 has been released, which has a big change, which is the default storage mechanism for Safari is now IndexedDB, and that's going to start the process of actually deprecating WebSQL, which is quite exciting. And Firefox 58 is here, which includes some awesome features such as add to home screen on Android. And on that note, don't miss next week's episode where we're going to be talking to Matt Claypotch, an engineer from Mozilla, is going to come and talk to us all about Firefox. So very much looking forward to that. And that's everything from me for This Week in Web.
Thank you, Leon. Yeah, I'm slightly sad that WebSQL never became sort of a thing. Like, I understand why, but at the same time, like, I always thought it was kind of cool. And the Firefox 58 thing, I mean, the thing that I also love about 58 is that it has font display, which is a really great CSS sort of thing for making fonts on the web basically suck less, which is, I think, pleasant. And speaking of new fanciful things, let's pull out the crystal ball. It's 2018. The web at this point has become sentient, and it now controls your every move. But what have you guys been working on? What's new in 2018 that, where have you started your 2018, gentlemen?
I can go first here because I've got a relatively short one probably. So as most people know, like web components is kind of my thing. So I've been looking looking a bit more of a kind of lesser used known part of the web component specification, which is customized built-in elements. A part of the spec which never really got fully adopted. It's not implemented in Chrome. It basically allows you to extend native DOM elements with web components and augment stuff, add new features or change the UIs and those kind of things. So I've just really been looking at different ways that you can extend native elements, such as the image tag, or actually turn an input type checkbox into an actual switch and all those kind of things, and trying to understand that part of the spec a little bit more and try and understand kind of why it wasn't quite agreed upon. Hopefully going to learn lots doing that, and hopefully I'm hoping that this year maybe the browser vendors will come to an agreement on the best way to kind of implement that part of the specification, because I think the ability to actually extend native elements is such a huge feature for web components. I think it's important that we figure out the best way to do that.
So it's Firefox has that, right? But they're the only browser vendor?
I don't think they have it yet, but they did say they were actually going to implement it. So when they announced they were going to implement custom elements, they said that they would going to implement that part of the specification. So when they finally do that, unless something changes, they will be the only browser vendor to actually implement it, which is really good. Even if that ends up not being the actual spec that actually gets implemented, it's going to give people the opportunity to really try it out in more detail and kind of see how it works. And I mean, the web components polyfills do allow you to use that part of the specification in all of the browsers. at least to some extent. So yeah, it'd be good to see what happens if, when Firefox finally get there. Maybe that's going to, what I'm hoping is it's going to encourage the other browser vendors to come to some conclusion and decide what they're going to do. So I'm hoping we'll be able to ask a few of the browser vendors if they come on the show over the next couple of months.
So is it part of the same V1 spec that the other browsers are implementing now, or is it a different part of the spec entirely?
No, yeah, well, from what I understand, it's part of the same specification, but you've got autonomous custom elements, which is the custom elements that you kind of know and love, and then you've got the customized built-in elements, which is this additional piece to allow you to extend native elements. And the way you do that is I don't know whether anybody's kind of spotted this, but you can basically, when you create your web component class and then do extends HTML element like you would do with a normal custom element, you can do extends HTML input element. And then when you actually define your custom element, you can then add so you give it the tag name and then the prototypes of the class that you've created. And then as a third argument, you can provide an object and you can specify a property in there, which is extends. And then you can say like extends input or extends button or something along those lines. And then when you want to actually extend a native HTML element, you do is as an attribute on that element and then specify the custom element name that you created. And that will basically kind of upgrade that element and you'll be able to hook into its lifecycle events and add new functionality and those kind of things. That's that piece.
Okay. So I know that even that syntax was a little bit, not everybody could agree on that syntax. That is syntax that you just referenced. I know that there were quite a few people that weren't totally on board with that. Honestly, I don't have a real strong opinion about it. I just remember there being quite a bit of discussion around it.
Yeah, I think it is a bit funky. I mean, to be honest, I think what you really want to do perhaps is just do class extends and then the thing you want to extend and then off you go kind of thing. But I think there's lots of difficulty around what's currently being adopted on the web and how browser vendors implement and a lot of tools rely on the actual tag name of the actual elements to determine how to do different things. I don't fully understand all of the intricacies yet, but I'm hoping to. Again, maybe some of the browser vendors and we'll be able to shed some light on some of the more specifics as to why this particular part of the spec is going to be quite difficult, and was one of the solutions that solved a lot of those problems. From what I understand, again, I'm no expert in this particular area just yet.
That's pretty cool. Justin, if you don't mind, I can go next.
No, Danny, go right ahead. What's on your plate, sir?
So in the spare time that I do have, I've been starting to hack on some machine learning stuff with a couple of buddies of mine, Aaron Druck and Cody Henthorn. So pretty much what we did is we wanted to start trying to grok some machine learning stuff, but reading about it is actually really difficult because there's a lot of times there's a base level of knowledge that's expected. In the thing that I don't see a lot of machine learning, like articles and that kind of stuff explain really well is how to start thinking about a problem in different terms. Because in general now you're like, okay. So we started with tic-tac-toe, something really simple. We're like, okay, let's figure out how we can teach a computer how to play tic-tac-toe. Not write an algorithm to tell it how to win, but through experience, get it to coax it into making the correct decision at the correct time. So that was something that we started working on, and we did it now. There's the repository is on my GitHub. It's just called XO. If anybody wants to look at what we did, it's really simple. It doesn't scale past tic-tac-toe, but it is an easier way to look at in code. It's like, oh, okay, this is all this is doing. It's not really doing anything super complicated, and it was kind of fun to get to do it. But that's one of the things that I've been working on, and we're also working on how to make this current implementation more performant, and to change kind of how the quote unquote brain remembers things, so that we can scale to like Connect 4, something like that, just for fun. But that does bring up some of the other things that I've been trying to read about and look at, just as the web going forward. I don't know if this is a 2018 thing necessarily, but machine learning is obviously being used for a bunch of different stuff in the technology world in general. But it's also, I think it will be curious to see what folks start to do with it with the tools we use to write code. So, for example, maybe something that can actually that can write some of the code for you based off of stuff that it already knows. Maybe that means it's actually better tooling for, better predictive help while you're coding, where it's like, if you start typing something out, it's like, oh, hey, are you trying to do this thing? If that's the case, okay, let's go ahead and do it. Some stuff that we already have there, but approaching the same problems from a different point of view, it potentially open up different things that we might not expect.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point earlier where you said that when you're talking about how you've not seen many articles that kind of talk about how to think about a problem differently. And I think that's a really important thing, because I think even though, I think when you start thinking about machine learning or you mention it to somebody, the first thing they think of is maybe Python or something along those lines. And, maybe as web developers, we don't really think it's going to affect us too much, but it's going to, I think, completely change how we solve problems, just, typical app problems or anything really that, that our front ends kind of interface with, because it's going to provide a completely different way of solving particular problems. And it's really going to change the way we need to think about solving particular problems and try and harness some of that, the benefits of machine learning. So I'd be interested to know your example. What did you write that in?
So we did it in TypeScript.
Cool.
So, so you just need Node to run it. One of the reasons we did that is it was kind of the shared, the language that we kind of shared the most expertise in. Aaron and Cody both done Java for years and years and years and that kind of stuff. So it was kind of easy to at least start approaching things that way. And also just with a lot of the built-in support for, stuff that, some of us might not have been familiar with, it was really handy. But I do think that, that point that I did bring up is why tic-tac-toe is a good example. There's also a link on the GitHub repository to this really interesting video where somebody taught a pile of matchboxes how to play tic-tac-toe. And this is not a new thing. This is a theory for a long time. And we pretty much just implemented that video in code rather than rather than with matchboxes. But the idea is that there's a finite number of states in tic-tac-toe. So you can say, okay, in this state, these are the potential moves I can do. You fill the little box with beads, you shake it up, and you pick one out of it, and eventually it goes. And so eventually the boxes with and then if a certain set of moves leads to the pile of matchboxes winning, you add more of that color of the path it took to get there. You add more of those colors into the particular boxes. So eventually it's just really unlikely that the computer or the pile of matchboxes or whatever makes a bad move. It's just statistically unlikely that it actually happens. But it's interesting to make it work because it is a really simple problem to solve. Even if you were just going to write because it would be pretty simple to just write a program that would never lose. They would just never lose at tic-tac-toe. And we found with our implementation after about I don't remember the numbers, because we let some run for quite a while, but it's if you let it play 1 million games, it just always starts tying itself and eventually it stops, which is interesting. And then at that point, if a person played it, because we wrote a command line interface so you could play against the computer yourself, after it got to the point where both brains, X and O, were tying all of the time, you couldn't we couldn't beat it anyway. We would always tie. The other interesting thing is that if you then take a trained brain, so say you start 2 from 0 and it takes 1 million games or something before they're both oh yeah, no, cool, I'm never gonna, I'll never lose now. And then you take our base brain image, if you will, where it doesn't know anything, everything is equally as likely. It takes orders of magnitude less time, fewer games for the dumb brain to get up to the same speed as the previously trained brain. So it was kind of cool to do, but because it's such a simple game, it's easier to think about it versus a lot of the really cool things that are happening now with like image processing and natural language recognition and a bunch of these really, really impressive, really complicated problems go, this is much easier to understand.
What was the hardest thing out of everything you did in that experiment?
So honestly, so none of it was actually very difficult. The hardest part was we had is that the only way to test it is to just let it run. And so the most difficult part ended up being finding a bug that I introduced where there's a function that determines if there is a winner on the current board. And that was wrong. So the computer was actually playing, because there would be certain ways that you could just beat it all the time. And you're like, that's very strange. It's like, why, after all of this, would it never know to block here or something like that? It was actually playing a completely different game than we were, because its win conditions were different. So that was actually some of the most the trickiest part in this particular case, just because I messed it up and we had to find where it was. But ultimately, it's just that. It's okay, how do I decide what the win conditions are for whatever you're trying to do in this case, and then what does the computer get for getting it correct? Because I was also talking to somebody else because ultimately the main kind of goal is that, or the end game of this kind of engine is that it always ties, right? Because the only way to really lose a tic-tac-toe is if somebody makes a mistake. So the idea is that it would make no mistakes, or like out of several million games, maybe it loses one or something like that by random chance or something like that. But pretty much for it to tie. So right now it doesn't give any benefit to when it ties. If you have a game and it ties, it doesn't learn anything from it. It says, okay, whatever I did must have been fine, but I'm not going to give a bump to anything that I did, or I'm not going to decrease. I'm not going to take a penalty for anything I did. But if you actually trained it that tying, which is the end state, is just as good as winning, for example, it would actually probably get to tying much quicker. Now, it might actually tie some games it could have won, but getting to the end state would be faster.
That's really interesting. We'll definitely stick the link to that repository in the show notes. Justin, you build lots of things. Have you done anything with machine learning or anything along those lines?
Sometimes I've trained a lot of things over the years. I have really funny stories of training things wrong, in particular, where I know we once did an in-browser demo of sort of like an OpenBR clone that was taking live feed stuff through. I forget which API it was at the time. It wasn't the more standard Get Media APIs that we have today, but at the time it was taking a video feed in and it was doing processing in JavaScript, and it wasn't terribly fast. But I remember we had trained the model wrong, and it was identifying men as women and women as men. So we had run a demo for some folks, and like they were like, it was very, very wrong, and it was cool, like, but they were really confused. And I think a lot of that is much more accessible and very different context now. Like beforehand, you had to have a lot of horsepower, and now you can get away with a lot of that stuff on just sort of regular machines to some extent, as opposed to sort of things like TensorFlow and everything else, where you can define those things a lot quicker and you get a lot more value out of it, where you can do an integration within your apps that is simply more feasible than a lot of the sort of things that you would run within your own stacks previously. So I think there's been a lot of gains over the last, even just the last year, where it's become way more accessible, which I think is a lot more cost effective, I think, in a lot of cases.
So here's a question to you both. Do you think that machine learning is something that web developers should be looking at learning in 2018?
I think it is something that you should be aware of. In the same way that, like if you're doing, let's say that like you do mostly front end stuff, it is still helpful to be aware of how some back end stuff works, even if you're not, an expert in it or doing something at the same time. I think so. I think to that level, it is something that everybody should at least take some kind of an interest in to try to figure it out. I think part of the hurdles to that have been, like I've said a couple times already, is just like learn. It's like, well, like I don't really know what that means. How do I start? Like, what does solving a problem with machine learning versus algorithmically mean? There's a course coming up by the folks at ThoughtRam that I think is supposed to be geared towards this a bit more. So I'll find a link to that as well for anybody that is interested. It doesn't start yet. I think you can pre-order spots now, and it will be it'll be cheaper. It's not crazy expensive anyway, but so that might be a good place for people to go. And also just hopefully there are more resources, maybe some out there that I don't know, that do help broach the subject a bit more gently.
Yeah, I agree with Danny on that. Is that it's something to be aware of. I don't know that, for a lot of web developers, it's going to make like immediate sense as to how this sort of puzzles into an existing architecture, where it may be useful within the context of, a certain set of features they're developing for an end user or client. I think it is useful in a lot more cases now, primarily because it has gotten less expensive to do and the spin up time is simply less. So you should be aware of it. Is it going to change immediately the way that you're going to develop your applications today? Probably not. Probably not in 2018. Eventually, when we train them to just write code for us that we don't want to write. I don't want to ever write another for loop. I'm just going to start screaming at my computer, write me a for loop. And it's going to be like, which data structure? And I'm like, I don't care. And then you just,
You forgot OK Google.
Okay, Google, make me an app.
It's funny because I've had that has been a concept for a long, long time. Like I have seen every variation of the make me an app AI over the years. Everyone thinks they can do it. They think that, users can build their own apps by just telling the system, build me this app. And, sometimes they're closer than others, but eventually someone's got to usually write some code. Mileage will vary.
So what have you been working on, Justin?
Well, it is the beginning of the year, so at this point, I'm working on the magical next set of talks to give over the course of the year. Currently, I'm working on some Web NFC stuff because I've had Code Lab sitting for months that sort of need to be rounded out, and I'm still really excited about Web NFC. I'm also really excited about generic sensor API, which I'm hoping other browser vendors will sort of take up. I like those kind of integration stories primarily because you can get away from a lot of the, if you write in-betweens, particularly for things like WebUSB, where I can get rid of a middleman ancient Windows 95 device that only ran this one driver because of this thing, and I can write some really trick stuff. So to sort of bring that to the web as opposed to onto something modern, as opposed to having to find things that will still run Windows 95, that would be lovely. These are the things that Justin hopes for, where, some of the legacy stuff gets at least slightly updated across the board. I do have a tendency to agree with you, Leon, that I think 2018 is the year of the web component. Like I keep hearing people who are now discovering the wonderfulness of custom elements and things. Not even necessarily the entire range of specs that are available. That makes me giddy with joy. And I know Firefox is, close to shipping the thing, the rest of the APIs, and everybody else is working on them. And these generally make me happy. I think that is a significantly nice story to tell for a much more standards compliant way of building sort of interop components as opposed to siloed frameworks. So that excites me these days.
If you also look at some of the different frameworks that are out there, are starting to consider web components very seriously, almost as compile targets. So if you look at the obvious one is Stencil JS from the Ionic team, which is very cool. It looks the kind of reminds me of Angular a little bit in some of the format, but it has a small virtual DOM layer, but the output is custom elements, which is really cool. And I think that if they don't already, they were like rolling in support for Shadow DOM and some of that other stuff. There's the Angular Elements project, which is a labs project, which I think might end up being a part of the version 6 when it's released here in a couple of months. At least an initial like experimental release out in, really to the public with docs and stuff. So it's interesting to see that. To see that bit as well. Like there is a benefit to web components other than just writing web components.
Yeah, I think that story is significantly more clear now than it was a couple years ago, where it seemed that everyone was very upset that things simply weren't good enough. I can't build my entire app with web components, which, as someone who's shipping a lot of, it wasn't, it didn't have necessarily the tooling or the setup or the everything that everybody wanted. And there was a lot of, it's never going to work sort of talk. And I've learned to bet on standards as best I can. Like I understand frameworks. I understand the usefulness for them in a lot of cases, but I also understand what happens when you don't have standards. You see fragmentation that pigeonholes you into being stuck in the IE loop of old, where, you end up always having to target subsets of things that, as opposed to the progressive enhancement story. And that to me is, in 2018 looks very, very bright as a whole.
Oh man, I just talking about getting siloed into these things. I just recently watched a video about, I think it was on Computer File, about web fonts and like the early days of web fonts and some of that stuff. Like, oh, that sounds miserable, but that is where we came from. And also, you're just talking about in the last few years. What I think we've been doing this show for 3.5 years or something like that at this point. We've been talking about web components almost the entire time. And it feels like, I do feel like there have been quite a few times where it's just like, oh, this is it. Any day now. Here we go. But now it actually does feel like it's happening.
Yeah, it's really cool. Yeah, you're both right. I mean, literally, Twitter's awash with new frameworks or new tools or new things using web components. It seems to be reaching a much wider audience now other than the people that are just interested in it. Really, really cool.
Yeah, and the tooling around them, I think that's really the story that makes them, to me, very cool, because you can use Stencil, or you can use Skate, or you can use Polymer, or you can, write them just purely by hand. You can have an opinionation about how you want to approach writing those things, but the interop story remains the same. Like, I can take any one of those things and stick them into my existing applications, whether I'm using frameworks or not, and I can use them. And 2017, that was like half my year last year. I wrote something like, by mid-year last year, I'd written like 500 to 600 web components for various clients over the course of all these integrations of legacy stuff and newer things and frameworks, and how does this going to work with this? And the story around that stuff, as it started to solidify and people got on sort of board with both the spec and the tooling continued to improve, and everyone's looking at now, the JS module story and how does that play into things. It does work. And now, like you said, Leon, now you look at Twitter where there was that it's never going to work. I hate web components, blah. And now it's like, oh, we're using web components now. Like, we're doing it with this, and we're using this, and we came up with this. We found it really works well. When I see other people tell those stories now, it to some extent takes weight off of my shoulders, because I feel like, no, you can't, you're making it up, Justin. You can't do these things with web components. I'm telling you, it's all good. Standard web things.
It probably won't be long until a lot of people are using them and they don't even realize, if a lot of these frameworks just adopt them as the component architecture that they use, then, a lot of people won't even realize, and it'll just be the way to do components on the web finally, which is brilliant.
I like to imagine like a groups of people that are, especially that will be getting into web development in the next, say, like 3 years or something like that, which will happen. And I still remember, and I know I've told this story before, when I first started doing web development, there was I don't remember what it was, but at some point I looked up. It's like, oh, how do I create my own custom HTML element? That has to be possible. That makes sense that would be a thing that you can do. And now, 7 or 8 years later, I'm just like, yes. But you are going to have people that, that's just going to become a thing that you can do. It's like, oh, how do I make a custom HTML element? Even if you Google that now, it's like, yeah, no, this is how you do it. And it's just the stuff that is available to folks coming into it now is just so good.
Yeah, the story, I think, it is a very different thing now. I think the biggest hurdle is that for all the things that we can do, I mean, I get this question a lot. I know you both do as well. People ask, well, how do you get started in web development? How do you get started sort of building these sorts of things? That's very hard to, it's very hard to sort of contain into like, a 30-second clip of like, oh, don't worry. First, you're going to need to download Node, and then you're going to clone half the internet, and then you're going to have all these tools, and the tools are magic. I feel like that story is also somewhat getting better. I think that it's, the nature of being able to simply write code and have it run in a browser, I don't think that's as far off as we think it used to be. Like, that was how everyone got started. Learning the base sort of things. I still wish the semantic web was, more semantic, but, one can hope and dream.
Yeah, the thing you're just saying there about it, just write stuff and it just works in the browsers. The story like that is so much better nowadays, isn't it? Because hybrid apps are so more capable now than they ever have been, especially with PWAs and everything. The fact that web development as a whole is so accessible. But now you can use those technologies to build so many more things than just, websites with cat pictures. I mean, it's really cool, exciting time to be part of it.
Leon, do you think that given sort of the growth of things, do you think that we're sort of bringing more people into the fold of web development? Because, we talk about, the advancements of sort of JavaScript as a language, and those things have been brought in, and now we have new specs. But you also have things that, like WebAssembly, where people would want to, use their compilers and things. I mean, do you think that we're going to pull more people into the mix that had sort of discounted the web as a platform that they wouldn't necessarily write for?
I think absolutely. I think the web has got such a huge reach on so many different platforms and so many different devices and things. And WebAssembly is a really good example of trying to find ways to maximize that reach, but still have the capabilities of some of the lower level languages. So I think the platform as a whole really is going to attract a lot more people, and even just like being able to write a web app and package it up in Electron and in Cordova shells and all that kind of stuff, which is kind of, feeling a bit outdated nowadays, but still it's such an amazing way for small companies to build really high quality applications and deploy them across all of the different platforms that all their users want to use with very little effort compared to what it would have used to have been. So, there's a lot of native mobile developers now, coming over to the hybrid side and building web apps because, it's just such a great way to do things.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about a lot of stuff going into 2018. Yet we actually haven't mentioned the term progressive web app really till now.
Progressive web apps. It's funny, Danny, because I gave a demo of an app that we're getting ready to ship for a client, and we took the app over to the plant and we were showing them this thing, and they're like, I thought we were building a website. I thought the thing was in a web browser. And I was like, that's the web. That's not a web. That's an app. Well, it looks like an app, but it is, but it runs in your web browser. It'll run in Firefox or Chrome or whatever you want to use. But it's on top of like scan guns, and like it's on like the sides of machines and stuff. It's still the web. Like that's how it works. It's a very hard thing for, I think, some users to grasp. There is a very blurry line there now with progressive web apps when you have an app that is very indistinguishable from sort of that native experience,
which has kind of been almost the point.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it definitely feels different these days, and with the performance sort of gains across the board with things like Service Worker, and now, I mean, we haven't mentioned, you talk about progressive web apps. I mean, Safari's getting Service Worker. Like, you talk about a boon. Like, It's like dreams coming true. It was the Christmas present of Christmas presents.
That will be huge. When Safari gets access gets access, when they're allowed to have Service Worker, after they implement and ship Service Worker, will they have shipped all of the cool things that come with Service Worker for like notifications and things like that?
I don't think they're shipping notifications yet. I think push is, I don't know if it's on their list. I haven't looked, but I know that, I mean, once you have the Service Worker sort of core, then, ideally, fingers crossed.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't even gotten the Service Worker yet, and we're like, all right, but what else?
I know, right? We're so spoiled as web developers with all these fancy APIs.
Because also at that point, based on the way that Apple runs or manages kind of like browsers on there, after Safari gets Service Worker, Chrome for iOS and Firefox for iOS will also be able to have Service Worker, correct? After it's in WebKit?
Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
Typically. So it's already, Service Worker is already available in preview on Safari, apparently. I don't know exactly how the release cycle works in terms of getting things in iOS, Safari, and those kind of things, but it always is very shortly after, from what I can tell, but somebody can correct me.
Cool.
Very cool.
So is this the year that everyone just says, you know what, all PWAs all the time? Is this it? Is 2018 the year? I feel like we're going to have this exact same conversation in 2019, but I'm asking anyhow. I
mean, honestly, I think pretty much. Like, I know, at least from my experience, I'm an Android user, and I'm pretty constantly deleting native apps off of my phone in favor of the PWA. I haven't used the Twitter native app in a very long time, just because Twitter Lite works so well. The currency calculator that I used for my trip last summer was a PWA, that Material Money one, and it looks great. So I will say, like, even for us at work, that's one of the things that we're looking at. Like, we have several web projects that we're looking at, and we're like, well, I think we'll have our first one, our first actual PWA coming up pretty soon, when we actually get to ship it. But even not just for our mobile stuff, for some of our dedicated desktop stuff, we're like, okay, well, we have this notification system that we wrote into the browser. Can we just get rid of that in favor of something else? Things like that.
So I'm not entirely convinced that we're going to abandon native applications and go straight for PWAs, just for a few reasons, really. I think PWAs make a lot of sense for a lot of situations. And maybe you guys have got the answer to a few of these questions. But for example, there's a lot of developers which make money purely off of just selling apps for 99 cents or whatever, right? And obviously, the App Store also gives you, an easy way to find applications that you don't know you want yet. Where I know there's quite a few PWA stores out there and stuff, but they're obviously not as nice an integrated experience as what you would get with the native app stores on the different platforms. So I don't know whether we need to do something special there for PWAs. So it's still, you can browse and look through things and look through ratings and recommendations and all those other kind of things. Because at the moment, at least the impression I get is you've got the Twitter app, and then they're like, hey, we've got a PWA instead, so you delete that and use that. But it's not, the discoverability isn't quite as good, I think. So I think we might have to do something there. Do you guys agree, or am I talking a load of rubbish?
So I don't think I necessarily agree. I actually think that the Google Play Store and the Apple Store have a discoverability problem of their own. Um,
Yeah.
I will say that I rarely, and this could also be, this is also just this is all very anecdotal, just from my point of view. Um, I rarely ever just browse through the Play Store. I'm almost always I The only reason I ever go there is because I found a link on the web.
Right.
Where it's like so like maybe it's like in a maybe it's an ad for something that I was like, oh, that game looks kind of fun, and then I tap that, and then it just opens up in the Play Store. I would be totally fine if I just press that, and then it's like, oh yeah, no, here it is, and then just opened up in a website, and now I have it. Um, so as far as, so I will say, like, as far as the like, oh, charge 99 cents for for a game or an app or something like that, that I have no solution to, and I'm not really honestly, I haven't really thought about that part of it. But I will say, most of the time I end up going to the App Store, it is from a link I found while browsing the web in some way.
Mm. I mean, maybe, in terms of making profit from selling apps, I suppose you just change the model to like a, in-app purchases type of thing. So people can still get your app for nothing, but then you make money that way, like a lot of apps are doing nowadays anyway. But it's just an interesting thing, I think, which is why it might take a while for us to kind of get rid of those traditional app consumption means. I don't know. Have you got any input to this, Justin?
I think some apps, I think that story is a little bit incomplete in terms of the progressive web app story, particularly the payment side. It's not that we don't have payments. It's that, structuring those things into things that people want to buy, I think will be sort of a barrier to entry for certain types of applications. A lot of the PWAs that sort of like I build for clients, or my company builds, or other companies like, that are out there, or internals, I think PWAs make a lot of sense, primarily because you just get, even if you're not using the entire swath of PWA technologies, the speed increase, the things that you can do in terms of offline and caching, and those things are valuable in their own sort of right. Like, that story seems pretty clear to me. Like, it's like using Service Worker now. Like, I can use Service Worker in a lot of contexts to store things that I just simply don't want to resnap every time someone reloads that web page, because I know it's just data that is, it's an immutable set. Like, I'll replace it when the hash changes.
Yeah.
But from an app store perspective, I think that's kind of a missing puzzle piece. I agree with Danny that I think the discoverability in most app stores is just rubbish in and of itself. And that really, based on some of the metrics that have been sort of, coming out the last year or so, app installs aren't very good. Like, people don't install quite as many apps as everybody says they do. And yet there's contradictory data on that too, right? Apple says that they're making more money than ever in the App Store, which says,
well, I bet they are. I bet they are making more money than ever, but I do not think that is because of everybody downloads a ton of apps.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I think that's an interesting story in of itself, right? Is that, the story that those storefronts tell to get people to build apps that, is that story true? Like, I don't know. Like, I can look at the data and go, I can see the trend. And again, in certain cases, a native app makes sense. Like, we're not all. I'm not saying abandon all native apps. Like, I'm not of that ilk. Like, I understand the difference between the context of using certain things, but the reality is, for a lot of things, number one, the barrier to entry for the web is significantly less. If the discoverability is still fairly decent in that I can send someone a URL and they can open that thing right now without a 200 meg install. And again, that's the same reason I use like the Twitter Lite app, right? It's lightweight. It works. It's why I use a lot of PWA sort of things on my devices, because they simply work at a fraction of the size and spin time.
Yeah, I think one of the best things about PWAs is the kind of like restrictions or the performance it makes you need to hit, for it to be really good. So all of the kind of guidelines it gives you and all of the things that, mean that, all of the PWA benefits aside, just the fact that your thing is going to be lightning fast and really slick, and it uses Service Worker and it works offline, and all those kind of things are just amazing in general, regardless to these other bits and pieces that we've just been talking about.
Yeah, the swath of APIs that are available now, it really has sort of changed the way that you can approach when you build those sorts of experiences for the web today. And I think that's the major takeaway for, at least the thing that I'm going to talk about a lot, I think, over the course of years, I just, do things, which is the web will do a lot for you if you invest the time to understand sort of what APIs are available, where the web is going. Because a lot of times in the past, people have brushed off, the spec is too big, it'll never get built. These things are going to take too long, we'll never get these features. I'm going to build native applications to fill this gap in the meantime, or native applications are the only way to build this, build these sorts of experiences. And I don't think necessarily that's the case. I think you'll always end up with hybrid approaches. I think, again, native apps aren't going to go away. Native apps have been around a long time, but platforms change. Platforms change over time, and people have a tendency to sort of forget that, especially within the context of mobile things. So beyond the magic of PWAs and with things, what else really is going to take off in 2018? What's the magical crystal ball say for you guys? I know we're getting close to the end of the show, but if you had to say one thing that you're probably going to, go, oh, I was totally right, or man, I was totally wrong on that. What's the thing for 2018 and the magical crystal ball fortunes the web is going to do?
I don't know whether it will happen, but something I'd really like is more browsers to do better, instead of having, I love Chrome, I use it all the time, and I'm probably not going to change, but it'd be really nice to see a lot more adoption of many more browsers, such as Firefox. I think Firefox Quantum and those releases, I think they're doing a really good job there, and it looks really nice. So I'm really hoping that there'll be kind of more competition in that space. That's what I'm hoping for. That's not particularly something I think is going to happen.
I would say so. I'm kind of with Leon on. I have something that I want to happen. I do not know exactly how it. I don't know exactly what this will look like, but I'm hoping for more progress on WebAssembly. So a lot of the work that Firefox has been doing is really cool. We did a show about WebAssembly a long time ago. Now at this point, I have to, I actually am trying to remember which house I was living in at that point. But I think there are a lot of really cool things about WebAssembly. For example, the way that it can stream and some other stuff like that. That right now it just seems like, oh, this is a toy. You can make some cool games with it or something like that. It'll run on a couple of browsers. But I think there are a lot of benefits to that type of approach, and I really hope that in 2018 sees more work done on WebAssembly. So I don't think it's going to take over, but some progress in the spec and implementation. I actually think WebAssembly is one of the other ones that's has a hard time explaining what it is. It gets a nice tagline, but then you're like, oh, and then Rust and C++ and stuff, and then you're like, wait, what? So the stories about how it works, I think sometimes are a little too, maybe a little bit too core for some folks, including me. I'm trying, but not there yet. So I would love to see work done on that.
I would like the internet to stop arguing about frameworks.
What?
Just stop. Just stop, internet. That's what I want. You can have a constructive conversation about architectures and things, but could we stop arguing about frameworks? Is the stone throwing really necessary 90% of the time? I suppose I'm just old at this point. I just like, I don't want to hear the same arguments over and over again. I would also like to see this is actually my pie in the sky wonderful goodness. I'd love for, if you're building tooling or frameworks or things that generally you can trace, I would love to see everyone publish performance traces all the time with their projects. Just dump the timeline. Let's see how the perf looks, because with the change in, sort of how Google ranks things. They want more performance sites, things that load faster, those sorts of things. Performance is going to be key. So make sure you run those lighthouse and web page test sort of things. That's the thing that I think is going to become much more talked about this year. Anything else before we hit the stop recording button and sign off here on episode number 151, gents?
I don't think so.
No, great episode. Thank you, guys.
We have solved all of the magical dilemmas of the crystal ball fortunes.
That was barely a sentence.
That was barely a sentence. I'm told sentences are out in 2018. Now it's just random phrases that kind of look like tweets but aren't really tweets. It's hard to tell. Well, with that said, we're going to wrap up episode number 151 of the Web Platform Podcast. Join us next week when we start a series of talks with browser vendors about all the really interesting stuff they're bringing to the platform, including folks from Firefox and Chrome and Edge and all kinds of folks. It's going to be an amazing time. And hopefully we will see you next week. Leon, Danny, thanks.
Thanks, Justin.
And we'll see you all next week.